The question now is no longer whether violence has returned to northern Mali. The real question is whether the Sahel is entering a new phase where governments refuse to accept the old security order that shaped the region for decades. What is happening around Kidal is now described by Bamako not as a local rebellion, but as a hybrid war involving armed groups, information warfare, foreign pressure, and competing geopolitical interests. For Mali and its allies inside AES, this confrontation has become a test of sovereignty itself. If Bamako loses control of the north again, critics will argue that the new security model has failed. But if Mali succeeds in stabilizing Kidal, the balance of influence across West Africa could begin to shift. Recent military operations and coordinated statements from AES leaders show that Mali is no longer preparing for temporary containment. The government appears ready for a prolonged confrontation designed to prove that the Sahel can defend itself without returning to the old structures dominated by foreign military influence. In this analysis, we will examine why Kidal has become the center of a much larger geopolitical struggle, how Assimi Goita and AES are reshaping regional security strategy, why Western governments are reacting with growing concern, and what this crisis could mean for the future of Pan-Africa and West Africa. And if you enjoy strategic Africa news and deep analysis about AES and the Sahel, make sure to follow the channel because the events unfolding in Mali may reshape the region for years to come. Kidal is no longer viewed by Bamako as a distant desert city facing another cycle of rebellion. For the Malian government, the battle over Kidal has become a direct challenge to territorial authority and political survival. Mali's leadership increasingly argues that armed groups are operating through cross-border networks, information campaigns, and external pressure designed to weaken the country's new security direction. Kidal carries enormous strategic importance because it sits near critical desert corridors connecting Mali with Algeria and Niger. Whoever controls this region gains influence over movement, supply routes, and armed networks operating across the northern Sahel. But beyond geography, Kidal has become symbolic. For years, it represented the limits of Bamako's authority in the north. That is why the current escalation carries such political weight. Malian authorities now argue that the conflict is no longer an isolated insurgency. From Bamako's perspective, the crisis has evolved into a hybrid confrontation combining insurgent alliances, cross-border logistics, media pressure, and geopolitical competition. This shift explains why Assimi Goita is placing so much political capital behind the military campaign. For Goita, the battle is not simply about defeating armed groups. It is about proving that Mali can defend its territory through a new regional security model built around AES. Unlike previous years, AES is no longer functioning as a symbolic alliance. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are increasingly coordinating intelligence sharing, military planning, and regional security operations. The alliance wants to demonstrate that the Sahel can create its own defense structure without depending entirely on external military powers. Ibrahim Traore has played an important political role by presenting AES as part of a broader Pan-Africa movement focused on sovereignty and strategic independence. At the same time, Abdurrahmane Chiani provides the geographic depth that connects the security interests of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso across the region. Together, these leaders are attempting to transform AES from a reaction to crisis into a long-term regional security framework. And for Goita personally, the outcome in Kidal may determine whether that vision gains credibility or begins to collapse under growing pressure. Western governments and international organizations are increasingly reacting to the situation in Mali with concern. Most criticism focuses on three major issues: human rights allegations, cooperation with Russian security structures, and the growing influence of military governments across the Sahel. International media outlets frequently describe the conflict in northern Mali as evidence that instability continues to spread despite Bamako's new security strategy. Human rights organizations have also raised concerns about civilian casualties, disappearances, and the risks associated with expanded military operations in remote regions. Another major source of criticism involves Mali's cooperation with Wagner in the past and Africa Corps today. For many Western officials, the growing relationship between AES governments and Russian security partners is viewed as part of a broader geopolitical shift that could weaken Western influence in West Africa. At the same time, AES leaders strongly reject the argument that the old system was working effectively. From their perspective, years of international military presence did not stop the expansion of armed groups across the Sahel. Instead, insecurity continued to spread across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, despite massive foreign involvement. This is the core of the AES response. The alliance argues that sovereign states must have the right to choose their own security partners and redesign their defense structures if previous strategies failed to restore territorial stability. At the same time, the debate remains deeply complex. Critics argue that military operations alone cannot solve the crisis and warn about long-term political consequences. But supporters of AES respond that no government can preserve sovereignty if it permanently loses control of strategic territory. That is why the confrontation over Kidal is becoming far larger than a local military campaign. It is evolving into a struggle over who has the authority to define security, legitimacy, and political independence across the future of the Sahel. The outcome of the confrontation in northern Mali could reshape the future of AES and influence the political direction of the entire Sahel. If Mali succeeds in stabilizing Kidal and maintaining long-term territorial control, the alliance will gain significant credibility across West Africa. A successful campaign would allow Bamako to argue that the new regional security model is capable of protecting sovereignty without returning to older systems dominated by foreign military structures. It would also strengthen the political influence of AES leaders such as Assimi Goita, Ibrahim Traore, and Abdourahmane Chiani, who continue to present the alliance as an alternative path for regional security cooperation. Such a result could encourage other African governments to study the AES model more seriously. Across the continent, many countries are watching the Sahel closely because the crisis raises larger questions about sovereignty, territorial control, and strategic independence. But the risks remain extremely high. If Mali fails to secure the north, armed groups could gain a major symbolic victory. Critics would argue that AES lacks the military capacity needed to stabilize the region, while international pressure on Bamako would likely intensify. Instability could also spread further into neighboring countries already struggling with insurgent violence. The situation highlights an important lesson for many African states. Sovereignty cannot survive through political speeches alone. Governments must also maintain territorial control, effective security institutions, reliable logistics, and public confidence during prolonged crises. Modern conflicts are no longer fought only with weapons. They are also fought through information campaigns, media narratives, diplomatic pressure, and competing international interests. That is why many countries across Africa are watching Mali carefully, because the struggle over Kidal may become one of the most important geopolitical tests the Sahel has faced in years. What is very good happening in Mali today is larger than a single military campaign or one confrontation in Kidal. The real test now is whether AES can transform political declarations about sovereignty into a stable and lasting regional security structure. Assimi Goita has chosen a path that carries major risks. By expanding military operations in the north and refusing to return to older security arrangements, the Malian leadership is attempting to prove that national control over territory and strategic decisions cannot remain dependent on outside powers forever. But the future of this strategy will depend on more than military victories alone. Long-term stability requires sustained territorial control, functioning institutions, economic resilience, and the ability to maintain public trust during a prolonged period of pressure and uncertainty. At the same time, many countries across West Africa and the broader Pan-Africa movement are carefully watching what happens next. For some observers, AES represents an effort to redefine sovereignty in the Sahel. For others, it remains a risky experiment facing enormous political and security challenges. What happens in Mali could eventually influence debates far beyond Bamako. From Burkina Faso to South Africa, from the African Union to regional security discussions across West Africa, the questions raised by AES are becoming impossible to ignore. Because in the end, this story is not only about Assimi Goita, Ibrahim Traore, or one conflict in northern Mali. It is about whether African states can build security systems strong enough to protect their sovereignty in a world shaped by hybrid warfare, geopolitical rivalry, and constant pressure from competing global interests. And if you want more strategic African news and deeper analysis about AES, the Sahel, and the future of Pan-Africa, make sure to follow the channel and stay with us for the next report.